Three, two, one. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Insight Podcast. I'm your host, Nikon Gormley, and today I have a special guest. So I'm going to read you a little bio about her, and then I'm going to bring her on. So my next guest is a lifelong learner of what it is to be human. She teaches, she coaches, she podcasts about the inside out understanding, and also known as the three principles, which is a lot of the things that we talk about on this podcast. And since 2008, Alexandra has written both fiction and nonfiction books, all with the themes of love, connection, and the search for understanding. And fun fact, she began her writing career with an Amazon best-selling, award-winning memoir about 10 years she spent in a cult in the 1990s. So without further ado, welcome Alexandra Amor.
Hi, Nikon. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. This is the first time I've done an intro like that, so thank you for being with me on that. I
Oh, it
saw
was
somebody else
great.
do that. I was like, oh, I'm gonna read the bio first and then intro them. And I was like, okay, it worked out. It worked out.
I liked it.
So I think about 2 weeks ago, I was on your podcast and I so enjoyed our conversation. I wanted to bring you on to this podcast to share your experiences, your wisdom, um, what things look like to you. So before we begin about the topic that I would love to ask you about, I'd love to get some context of like of your story. Like, how'd you get here? Like, who are you? I mean, we read your bio, but like, I would love to hear it from you.
Right. Yeah. Well, you mentioned the cult, so that happened in the 90s. So I was about 21, almost 22 when I joined, and then 32 when I
Mm,
left. And I think even at that young age, I was a seeker, someone looking for answers,
mm,
looking for, yeah, just exploring life and figuring things out and that kind of stuff. And when I left the cult, it was about 10 years of recovery from that experience. And and that experience really damaged my relationship with myself, of course, and with my interest in spirituality and personal development. And because cults really use that natural desire against the people who are in the group
mm,
and really yeah, turn it on them. And so it took a lot to recover from that. And then once I had done a lot of that recovery work, I noticed that I just naturally continued seeking, interested in all kinds of self-help stuff and personal growth things. And one thing we're going to talk about is resolving an unwanted habit. So I had an overeating habit, and that was the thing that really drove my exploration a lot of the time. And nothing really worked. And that went on for, 20 years, something like that. And I could really see that I was putting a lot of effort into learning. I wasn't just sort of fiddling around. I was really devoted to finding an answer to that problem and joining classes and taking courses and reading books and everything. And nothing just really worked, like I said. So then in 2017, a girlfriend introduced me to the three principles. And I know you're a big Michael Neal fan. And the
yes,
funny
I
thing
am.
was, she had been talking about him for a couple of years. But because of my cult experience, I didn't listen because she was talking about him specifically rather than about the three principles in general, because he was the person that she was following at the time. So I just had kind of this knee-jerk reaction because of my cult experience. And what she was saying was just going in one ear and out the other. I wasn't interested. And then one day in 2017, she said something that really caught my interest. And I don't know what it was. I've forgotten it. But I went to Michael's website, and I don't know if he still does, but at the time he had a little series called The Basics. And you could scroll through from page to page and really read about what the principles were and that kind of thing. So I did that and didn't have a clue what he was talking about. It was really, but it intrigued me. And so that's when I started to explore it. And it has made a huge difference in my unwanted habit. And when that started to happen, I realized that there must be something special here.
Wow, what a journey. And thank you so much for sharing that. And I admire the energy in which you shared that story. There's, oftentimes in our line of work, you see so many people like they often parrot things, but then like for me, the end like your energy does the talking as much as what you're saying. And like the way you shared your story is just so peaceful and calm. And you're like, I don't know, I want some of that, to be able to talk about something like that with such grace comes to
Mm,
mind. So thank you
thank
so
you.
much. And
Thank you.
so if anybody who is interested to learn more about your experience can read your book, which is on Amazon. And what's the name of the book?
The book is called Cult, a Love Story, and it's available everywhere. You can ask for it at your local independent bookstore, or yeah, it's available everywhere online. It's in ebook, paperback, hardback, large print, and audiobook, and I narrated the audiobook myself.
Nice. In this podcast, we do the plugs early
Great. Get them out of the
because
way.
it just came up. So I would now love to dive into the topic of unwanted habits with you, because in my line of work, working with private clients and corporates and teams, and it's just something that comes up a lot. And it's something I'm seeing fresh too. So as of this podcast, I'm doing an online course called The Divine Engineering of Us with Mavis Karn and Azul. And in our last session, we had something come up that was really cool, and seeing how being discontent with the present was really a simply a habit of thought. And that's all it was. It was one of those like mic drop moments where you might if you tried to figure it out mentally, you wouldn't get it. But if you let it land in your heart, it's one of those oh shit moments. Because I saw it, like we all saw it. We're like, wait, yeah, I do have a habit of being discontent with the present. Like I need something, or this isn't good enough, or after I got this. And yeah, so I'd love to hear how you see unwanted habits.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting subject, and I know it's something that so many people struggle with, whether
Mm,
it's food or shopping or alcohol or whatever it is. And there are a few things that really struck me, and I would say the first thing that really caught my attention exploring this in an inside out way was that our unwanted habits are actually a sign of our mental health. They're not a sign that there's something broken about us. And the reason for that is that we all have this innate well-being and wisdom and resilience and this natural, calm, quiet, peaceful state that is Dr. Amy Johnson calls it home base.
mm,
And I love that because it gives such a good visual. But so what happens is the unwanted habits that we have are a very natural and normal way of trying to create that feeling of home base. So that's the first thing that really struck me. And I had to sit with that for a while to really let it sink in because we're so um, kind of brainwashed, I don't know what other word to use, to think of an unwanted habit as a huge problem. And it's something we need to get rid of, and it's something that's broken with us.
mm,
And so looking at it from the point of view that no, actually, it's pointing toward our innate well-being. That was really interesting to me. And yeah, like I say, that was sort of the first step in this exploration for me. So I'll stop there in case you have any follow-up questions.
mm. What occurs to me is I'm just curious now, because I think most people or most of the literature out there, like how to break a habit in 21 days and how to install the bad habit with a new habit. Like every time you feel like you want to smoke, you should go do push-ups or something instead.
Right.
I'd love to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, so there's this great metaphor
Mm,
that I first heard again from Dr. Amy Johnson. And so in the kind of traditional correction of habits world,
mm,
if you picture an iceberg sitting in a body of water, when we do those sorts of things, like doing push-ups instead of having a cigarette
yeah,
or whatever it is, and using a lot of willpower to
yeah,
try to control a habit, um, what we're actually doing is getting to the top of that iceberg and chipping it away at it with an ice pick.
yeah,
So it's a lot of work, and it's it's probably not going to get you very far. And that's
yeah.
definitely what I found in my 30 plus year search to resolve my unwanted habit. Alternatively, in this understanding, when we look at things from the inside out and we know that our experience of life is coming from our thinking, it's not coming from the outside in.
Mm,
What that understanding does is it actually simply raises the temperature of the water that the iceberg is sitting in. So the iceberg starts to melt. And that points to back to what I was saying earlier about how and I guess I'll say this another way now too, that when we focus on something that looks like a problem, it it tends to make the problem a lot bigger.
mm.
But when we turn our attention toward our innate well-being, the problem slowly melts on its own.
I'd love for you to speak more to that. I'm gonna ask you the Google search question, which is
Okay.
the Google search question is like, how do you deal with unwanted habits? How do I make it go away? Or like if you were to type it in YouTube, like when I look up the topics for my podcast, I'm like, what are other people asking? And I wanna because I want to answer that question from this understanding. So if I were to Google this, like how do I make this bad habit go away? How do I deal with it? And then what would you say to that?
Yeah, I would say that what what worked in the end for me was exploring this idea of innate well-being and resilience and our the health that is always available to us all the time. So when we want to end a habit, and instead of and what we have been doing is really focusing on the habit itself and spending a lot of time and attention and
Mhm.
energy looking in that direction. When we turn and look in a slightly different direction and explore how can it be that we are entirely well and whole when we have all kinds of challenges in life, and see what that looks like for you and what that might entail. Or how can it be that we live in the world of our thinking and not in the world of our experiences? Is that really true? And does that resonate for the person that's trying to end the unwanted habit? And what happened for me was when I started to see that my mind was naturally designed, divine engineering, as Mavis Karn calls it, naturally designed to settle down on its own. So there's a metaphor that we often use, which is that of a snow globe. You know, if you really shake a snow globe up, if you just all you have to do is set it down, and the snow will settle in the snow globe and become still. That's how we're designed as well. So to end a habit, it's a paradox, but what we really do is look toward that, toward our um, how how we are designed to settle and to be calm. And when we see that for the truth that it is, then we don't, one of the big aspects is then we don't need a substance to help ourselves settle down. Because the other aspect of this is that a habit is actually a solution. And I can get into that a little bit more, but when we have a habit that we're using, what we're really doing is soothing ourselves, trying to get ourselves to be calm and quiet, like I said earlier. And when we begin to realize that that happens on its own anyway, we don't need to use that substance to create that end result. That's a really big leap forward.
It's wonderful. I totally relate. And so I don't think I've shared it in this podcast, but probably somewhere. So I used to have like my I used to have like a big porn addiction as a young man. And when I came into this understanding that that addiction really, or you call it a habit too, really dissolved itself almost overnight. And what was really cool about that is I had front row seats to watching it dissolve. Because
Yeah.
similar to echo what you were saying, I noticed that I wasn't so interested in the content. I was interested in what was happening in my mind when I was being stimulated by that content. And so this is my other habit, right? Of like overthinking and overanalyzing previously, because I didn't know I had that habit until it came to this understanding. I was like, oh shit, like I don't think that's a good thing to do, you know? And so, anyways, I noticed that when I was being stimulated by that content, my mind would just shut up. Like
Hmm.
my mind would just like, and I was
Yeah.
like, oh, peace. And then, so as in this context of habits, I see the innocence. I would like, well, of course you would go to porn if your mind went quiet, like if and you don't like meditating anyway. So like you're just at this point, you're just trying to self-soothe and get to a quiet headspace. And the moment I saw that, I realized I didn't need the content to get to the peace of mind. I just had to learn to notice where I was, how I was using my mind, where I was putting my attention on my thoughts. And overnight, it just, the content just seemed less and less interesting to me. Like just like that, literally
Yeah.
just like that. I didn't have to do any push-ups. I didn't have to, like find another stimulus, like da 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 da.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask you more about that and how the shifts in consciousness seem to like on from the outside in, like from someone looking on the outside, it seems to magically reduce suffering and magically make habits go away. What do you make of that? What is it about our divine engineering, as Mavis calls it, or shifts in consciousness that return us to common sense?
Mm. Wow. I don't know that I have an answer. I I just know that they do. Yeah, that this was an entirely new idea to me when I came into this understanding that these shifts in consciousness that we call insight are what create real change.
Mm,
And when we try to change a habit from, in the way that we've been conditioned to think that we have to change them, like we talked about earlier, um, they can just become really stubborn and the problem can seem to grow. That was certainly the case for me. All that work sort of made it worse rather than better.
oh, mm,
Yeah, but when we know that we can rely on the wisdom that's within all of us to provide insight about who we really are, then that becomes the thing that we can turn to toward to create change. And I had a similar experience to you. I had a soda habit for 30 years, and it was something that had tried to quit endless number of times. And I would just have one can of soda a day at lunch, but I didn't like that I was doing that. I didn't like the sugar that was involved in the soda.
mm,
And had, like I say, had tried to quit a bunch of times. And so when I came into this understanding and learned not to focus on those problems, so I sort of set the soda habit aside. I just thought, well, it is what it is, and I'll just leave it alone. And I continued to have the habit. Eventually, I noticed I was hardly drinking any of the regular size cans of soda.
Mm.
So I switched to those little mini
Yeah.
ones. And that went on for several months. And then one day I was in the grocery store and I went down the soda aisle to get my little cans of soda. And as I went to reach for them, my body just went, meh, not interested at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
And it was so shocking to me. I was stunned because, like I say, this is a 30-year habit that I had tried to get rid of endless times. So that when that happened, that was a real pivotal moment for me. That just as you said, we somehow via the insights that we have, we just lose interest in our the habits that have, can dog us for a really long time.
Yeah. As you were sharing, the metaphor that occurred to me is how I'm sure most people have heard this signal versus noise, and how I wonder if our divine engineering or in our innate intelligence is always there. It's always present. And as we have higher shifts in consciousness, there's just less noise and the signals become more clear. And
Mhm.
it can able and we have the space to really hear it, like within ourselves. Because sometimes we're so busy, we're so overwhelmed and overloaded, we don't know it. And we're just like, nope, nope, nope. And then one day it's like, oh, that makes complete sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And the habit is really trying to calm the noise. So
Mm,
when the noise starts to quiet on its own, because we know it can,
mm,
then the habits start to fall away. Yeah. So that's a great thing to point out.
mm, mm. It's almost, I can see in this conversation, I can see how the traditional approach to unwanted habits only adds to the noise and not reduce
Yeah.
it, because you got to think about it, you got to read up about it, you have to like go figure out the trauma that caused the habit, and that's just so much work, and it's so much, it stirs the pot, and it's even like the snow globe is like you're just shaking it up. And I see the innocence of it because we all want to do stuff about it. We don't want to suffer.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. There's another great metaphor that I love that if you do you know what an instant pot is?
I'm about to learn what it is.
Okay. So an Instant Pot is actually just a branded name for a pressure cooker. So a
Okay.
pressure cooker, it kind of looks like a rice cooker and it's got
Yeah.
a lid that
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
really seal on there. And it cooks the food inside via pressure rather than
Mm-mm-mm.
heat.
Mm.
And so one of the things that's always on a pressure cooker or an Instant Pot is a valve to
Mm.
let some of the pressure out.
Mm.
So an unwanted habit is like that valve. There's so much pressure going on within us because of the noise. And so there's the noise of the habit, that itself.
Mm.
And then, as you just said, there's all the noise of that we've added to that about trying to fix it and what's wrong with us. And yeah, digging into our trauma from our history and managing it. For me, there was so much effort put into managing it. If I was out for dinner with
Mm.
friends, thinking about what am I going to eat and what should I not eat and all
Yeah.
that kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
So the pressure inside that Instant Pot is just huge. So the habit is actually the valve on the top of that pressure
Mm.
cooker. It lets some of that pressure out.
Mm.
And then, just as we were talking about, as we learn that that there's this that there's the signal that we can listen to instead of all that noise, then the pressure just automatically reduces and there's less need for the valve to let off all that extra steam.
Mm. That's a wonderful metaphor. I'm so grateful we captured it. Definitely using that in a workshop for sure.
Oh, good.
That's a I that's a great way to look at it because oftentimes I think when people talk about suffering or when we talk about suffering, it's like there's something happening to you. You know, like I'm
Mm.
suffering from this thing from the outside in and from this bad habit, from this. And then, and to what you're pointing to is suffering is really your body telling you that there's something off here or to slow down and take another look and how helpful that is to have that built in.
Yes. And that was the something that I learned from Mavis Karn. She was sort
Mm,
of the first person that I heard talk about how our feelings are always feedback about our mental state.
mm,
They're always letting us know what's going on with us
mm,
mentally, and we can trust them. So if we feel something like a craving for whatever it is,
mm.
food, porn, whatever,
Yeah.
instead of demonizing it, looking at it like, oh no, this is a huge problem and I've fallen off the wagon or whatever, we can instead say, oh, my thinking is really stirred up. There's a lot of noise right now and not a lot of signal.
Mm. I love that. It's a complete shift in perspective that offers so much more freedom and ease and grace around it. And I was thinking about how mm, if habits are the solution. I wonder if have what where else have you seen it with like clients or case studies in the shifts that people have had around habits with different kinds of habits?
Mm. Like just different examples
Yeah,
of,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. I'm trying to think. Well, I mean, this is a really interesting point because I think we tend to think of habits as being their own specific thing. So if someone has an unwanted habit of over shopping, spending
Mm-hmm.
too much money, let's say, and that's the thing that's torturing them.
Mm,
We think of that as being different than someone who has a smoking habit, right?
mm-hmm.
And we tend to go, as we said earlier, into the person's past, into
Mm-hmm.
their trauma, when really all unwanted habits are the same. They
Mm,
have the same exact source, which is all that noise thinking that's in our heads and our natural way of trying
mm-hmm.
to manage it and bring ourselves back to home base and
Mm.
feel better about things. So yeah, and in terms of case studies, I think so far, I'm the case study that I'm the most familiar with,
Yeah.
but I know that there are lots of stories out there of people whose habits have fallen away simply
Mm,
by looking in this direction. I'm trying to think of an example now. Well, I mean,
mm,
Amanda Jones, who works with Dr. Amy Johnson, she wrote a book called Uncovery, which is about her recovery from binge eating. So
mm,
that's a really great example.
mm.
Yeah, so there are others out there that are exploring this and having the same results.
I really want to highlight what you just said because you hit it on the point. We tend to treat habits as individual things. Like, oh, you have a smoking habit. Here's a bunch of literature. Oh, you have a
Yeah,
pornography habit. Here's a bunch of like, oh, and then so what you're saying is when we go upstream and we look at the nature of habits, we really arrive at the same place, which is your body and your mind attempting to self-soothe to get to a
yeah,
quieter place. And because we don't, because when we're caught up, we don't see it. We like the shortcut, right? It's like, well, that's the shortest route. Hmm.
yeah,
And in this conversation, we've spoken a lot about the magic and people in the principles, like our divine knowing and divine engineering and innate wisdom. Is a question that occurs to me to ask you is how does one align to you? How does one align themselves more with that knowing with, in your words, the wisest part of themselves while they're facing challenges that might be creating suffering?
Yeah, that's such an important question. The way that it seems to me to work, what I see is that it's as simple as staying in the conversation, which is a bit of a cliche phrase, but it's really true.
Mm,
So the harder we try to look at something like this, the more noise we create. And so I always encourage people to hold their exploration really lightly.
mm,
And whatever that looks like for someone is that I feel like that's one of the keys.
mm,
So the things that I did were things like listening to podcasts while I was cooking. And I had Ian Watson on my podcast a while ago, and he talked about how when we begin to absorb this understanding, we become like a tuning fork.
mm,
So you just sort of start to vibrate at a certain frequency, and other people pick that up. And so the great thing about this day and age is that there's so much of that, so much information and understanding and conversation available to us in the form of podcasts and that kind of thing.
mm.
And simply listening will I hate to sound all woo woo about it, but it really does seem to just change our vibration just by paying a little bit of attention, by listening to something like a podcast or reading a book or an audiobook.
I love that. As you were sharing, and I thought, oh, I wonder what that looks like to me.
Hmm.
And I think my journey is very similar. It's just I don't think I just stayed in the conversation. I like jumped into the conversation. Everything I could get my hands on because I was so curious and wanting to know. And I
Yeah.
was now what it looks like to me. And it's funny enough you said listening because it to me it looks like listening. Like in the earlier
Mm.
conversation, we spoke about signals.
Mhm.
And if you think about it, there's nothing you can really do to make signals happen, right? The way signals work. You can just be a better receiver. And I don't know a better way of receiving signals than being a really good listener, like a really, really good listener. And you'll hear exactly what you need to hear. And I also think it's the intention, right? Because you're intending to to listen for the signals or to hear the signals and holding it light enough to not be so about it. And speaking of which, I thought of a case study.
Okay.
Just yesterday, I had a CTO call me, and he's a country manager for a new AI tech company, and he's been wrestling with like like a business challenge in his business. And so for context, they're in growth phase. So growth phase for people listening is the phase where the business is really trying to get to a level of income that's kind of stable. But if they're in growth phase, they're new, they're trying to get clients, they're trying to, like pay the bills. And from the outside in, it would look like a stressful thing to do if you looked at it from the outside. And the habit he had, which he didn't know he had, was he was addicted to trying to fix the problem right now. And that was the addiction. I mean, that was the
Mm.
habit. And it was so interesting. It was such, I'm remembering this conversation because it looked so weird to me that why someone would want to do that. And I could tell he was getting frustrated. He's like, what do you mean leave it alone? I can't leave this alone for 2 days. And I'm like, leave it alone for like an hour. Like, like it's not
Yeah.
nothing's gonna change anyways if you don't figure it out. And that looking in this conversation, I can see how differently that looked to me now. That why
Mhm.
would you want to try and solve a problem you can't figure out right now? Is like if you leave it alone for a bit and give yourself space and let your mind calm down, you'll probably have a shift in consciousness that allow you to see more. And because I do a lot of work with businesses and I see that as being a very common habit that they don't know they have. And I can see a lot of insecurity tied into it, a lot of ego, because if you're paid to solve problems and like I can't leave this problem alone. Like I'm getting paid to solve this problem, and if I can't solve this problem right away, what does that say about me? And I wish they would all just listen to this podcast episode so they could, well, they'll hear me talking smack about them, but they'll also hear your words that if they know it's a habit, they know they're free to not follow that habit.
Yeah, and not listen to that insecure thinking that's telling them, well, you're getting paid to do this,
Yeah,
so
or like you
do
can't,
something.
yeah, like you can't figure this out, loser. You know?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's all. I see the innocence of it, and I I see. I also see why I'm there to help point those things out.
Because he wouldn't have known that otherwise,
Yeah,
likely. Yeah.
or have someone at least in the room that says, raise their hands. Like I think this is a terrible idea. As brilliant, as smart as I think you are, you trying to solve this right now in this state of mind is just a bad idea. Yeah,
And I have been so guilty of that,
yeah,
needing an immediate solution to things and taking so much action out of a very churned up place. And it never worked out. Anytime I
yeah,
look at the big mistakes in my life, it was because I took action when I wasn't settled, wasn't calm,
yeah.
hadn't let things just evolve as they wanted to.
Right. You know what I love about this conversation is now that we're opening this can of worms, is people think of habits as just like maybe you can help me with this. What I want to articulate is when people think of habits, they think of smoking, pornography, alcohol, or overeating. And what's coming up for me is there are far more severe habits that we don't even see, like
Mm,
urgency, trying
yep.
to immediate satisfaction. All right. Overthinking, worrying, that drive a lot of these things. And I think the more we talk about this, the more people listen, I hope they'll see those habits too.
That's such a great point. Yeah. And it comes back to what we were talking about earlier is that traditionally we think of each habit as being its own
Right,
individual
right, right.
thing, but really, including all those ones you just mentioned, overthinking, worrying,
Yeah, yeah,
they all just fall under the same umbrella of not understanding. And it's just a simple, innocent not understanding of what we're made of and what we can rely on.
do you remember the movie Over the Bridge with Tom Hanks and another gentleman who was like a German spy or
Oh,
something?
I do. I didn't see
Right,
it, but
right. But
yes.
there's a scene in that movie where like the German spy is on trial and Tom Hanks is, I forgot, he was working for the CIA or something, but his job was to get that guy out. And they were in the courtroom, and Tom Hanks leans over and says, like, "Are you worried?" And the guy replies back, "Would it help?" You know?
Yes. Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's really as simple as that, isn't it? Because if you see
Hmm.
it, it doesn't make, like, why would I, like, would it help? Like, really, it was a genuine question. Like, if I worried about this, would it change anything? Yeah,
Yeah.
cool.
And I think that I just want to say that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier about working really hard on habits.
Mm.
So that, that's a form of worry. We want to, we think we're flawed and we need to get rid of it. So we really worry about it. Does it help? No.
I can't tell you how many times clients come to me and like those are one of the first things they come, like, I have this really bad habit, this really big thing. And my response is, don't worry about it. And they kind of do a Scooby Doo, like, what do you
Yeah.
mean? Don't worry about it. I just paid you to take care of that. I'm like, yeah, don't worry about it. Like, we'll come back to that. But I want to for us to explore the the inside out nature of life and how thought works. And I promise we'll come back to it. And 9 out of 10 times when we come back to it, that thing didn't look like a big thing anymore. It just
Mm,
like the metaphor
yeah.
that comes to mind is like the the puppy that has a shadow of like a great wolf. But then you see the puppy, you're like, oh, you know, yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
cool. So we're coming up on time. I'd like to ask you what if you were to give a gift to the people listening? It could be a knowing, a quote, a saying. What would that gift be?
Mm. This feels like a quiz. Um, what would I gift people? I think the thing that stays with me and has been so powerful for me is returning to the idea that we are entirely well. So even when we seem to have the worst habit, and maybe we've got five or six that are dogging us and really causing problems, that we're never ever separated from our innate well-being. And I know that that can look really impossible when you're really embroiled in, some sort of really heavy addiction that's driving you crazy and causing, and not to diminish the suffering. I suffered for so long, and people really suffer with unwanted habits and addictions. So it's not to diminish that at all. And I just want people to remember that underneath that, like a river that runs underground, there's always, always your innate well-being. As Mavis Karn says, you are not a problem. Oh,
Yeah, I'm
you're
muted. I haven't
muted.
heard that
Yeah.
one before.
Yeah.
You know what? My mind went to like internet memes where it's like, I'm a hot mess and you better like, if you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. I
Right.
approve
Yeah.
I'm a problem. Look at all my therapist receipts.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I can hear the truth in what you're saying. Because
Mm,
who you really are is really not the problem.
mm-mm,
Your thinking might be weird, but you're okay.
mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it will sort itself out when you see that it just naturally does settle
Mm,
down.
mm, brilliant. And if we wanted to hang out with you and learn from you more and work with you, where would be the best place to find you?
So my website is alexandraamor.com, and Amor is spelled Amor. It's the Latin spelling, so it doesn't have an E or a U.
Yeah.
And I have a podcast, as you mentioned. It's called
Yeah.
Unbroken, and
Yeah.
you were a guest on it recently.
Yeah.
And that also has a corresponding YouTube channel as well. So youtube.com/Alexandra Amor.
Brilliant. I will put all those links in the description for people to find them.
Thank you.
And for me on this podcast, it's been an absolute pleasure to explore with you habits. I think this conversation is going to be so helpful to so many people, and I can't wait to send it to them.
Well, thank you, Nikon. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you again.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm gonna stop recording. So for everybody listening, thank you for listening. And if you know somebody that you think this would be helpful to, Alexandra and I would both appreciate it if you sent it to them, because we'd love to have this conversation be helpful to as many people as it can. Cool. All right, so I'll see you later. Bye bye.
Bye.